So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining this webinar to learn about integrating hazards into the comprehensive plan. My name is Logan Sand, and I work as a recovery and resilience planner with the Department of Local Affairs, Division of Local Government. This is the second webinar in the Planning for Hazards webinar series. There will be several additional webinars this year in 2017, so stay tuned for future events and notifications. Today's webinar will be recorded and it will be posted to the Planning for Hazards website shortly after we conclude today's presentations. But before we get started, I would first like to say thank you to our partners. That includes the American Planning Association Colorado chapter, the Colorado Municipal League, Colorado Counties Incorporated, and the Denver Regional Council of Governments. So today I'm joined by Tarek Wafai, who's a senior associate at Clarion Associates, Rachel Bacon, a senior long-range planning strategist for Adams County, and Karen Berchtold, a planner too for the City of Manitou Springs. So why is the topic of integrating hazards into the comprehensive plan important? Currently, Colorado has a population of 5.5 million, but it's projected to grow to about 8.6 by 2050. So how we grow will shape the long-term economic, social, and environmental health and viability of Colorado and its communities. Colorado is also no stranger to hazards. Since 2010 alone, wildfires and floods have destroyed more than 3,000 homes, caused more than $5 billion in impacts to Colorado, and changed the lives of thousands of Coloradans. So Colorado experiences dozens of floods annually and over 2,400 wildfire events each year. But it's not just floods and fires. There are many other hazards that are also present throughout the state of Colorado. In addition, Colorado's climate is currently projected to increase from 2.5 to 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. So every community faces vulnerabilities, whether they're natural or man-made, but we tend to think of vulnerability in terms of a community's abilities to cope with shocks and stresses. So as Colorado continues to grow and the climate continues to potentially change, the comprehensive plan can be used in a strategic and long-range as a strategic and long-range planning tool to build community resilience by minimizing or avoiding exposure to natural and human-caused hazards. Today's webinar is going to focus on how local governments and communities can reduce their risk and vulnerability by integrating risk reduction strategies into the comprehensive plan. So quickly, as an overview for the presentation, we'll begin by providing a detailed overview of the comprehensive plan tool that's included in the Planning for Hazards Land Use Solutions for Colorado Guide and website. This will help provide a foundation for understanding the process and various approaches for integrating hazards into the comprehensive plan. Then we'll hear from two Colorado case studies, Adams County and the City of Manitou Springs, about the processes and best practices that they used and the lessons they learned in integrating hazards into their comprehensive plans. So we'll end the webinar with a bit of time for some questions and answers with our audience. At any point, if you have any questions, please type them in to either the host or to everyone in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll try and get to them as soon as you can at the end of the webinar. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tarek to give us a little bit of an overview.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here today. Thank you all for dialing in. This is an exciting topic for us, and I work for Clarion Associates. We're a land use planning firm out of Denver. We do a lot of zoning code work. We do a lot of planning work at the same time. So when we talk about integrating planning policy into regulations, the comp plan is really one of the most direct ways to influence how you would end up with a good set of regulations. So today we want to focus a little bit on the tool that was presented in the Planning for Hazards guidebook. If you have not checked that out, I would encourage you to do so, and I will show you where that website is located in a moment. I am going to focus on really the nuts and bolts of the comp planning tool, talk about a few different approaches for how to integrate hazards, and then we'll turn it over to the case studies. So here is the URL. You can look at it now if you like, and while you're listening in to the discussion. But planningforhazards.com, there are a lot of different sources of information on there, a lot of different planning tools. Again, today we're primarily going to focus on the comprehensive plan. So here's a quick look at all of the planning tools that are profiled on the website in the printed guide. There are 25 tools up there. Not going to read them aloud, but really they're divided into 6 different categories. There's how to influence plans and policies, how to strengthen incentives, how can we improve site development standards, how can we look at our buildings and infrastructure and how to improve them through capital improvements, and how we can also look at our administration and procedures and site development standards to make sure that we're integrating natural hazards. So again, some of those are really focused on very specific issues. But the comprehensive plan is special because you really touch on all of those issues. Your comprehensive plan is a great way to influence policy on basically anything for your jurisdiction. So what is in the tool? Here's how to access from the home page. Click on Tools, click on Addressing Hazards in Plans and Policies, and the first option is the comprehensive plan. When you get to the comp planning tool in the printed guide or on the website, first there's a description of what is a comprehensive plan and why is that important to your community. And then it really describes how the tool works. Is this something that needs to be adopted? Is this something that requires a resolution? We really get into the nuts and bolts there. And then want to just remind you that the focus on the tool and on the Planning for Hazards guide is on Colorado communities. So if you're outside of Colorado, you should know that statutory requirements and enforceability of a comprehensive plan varies widely across the country. So keep that in mind as you're reviewing the tool. But within this tool, it focuses again on 4 integrating hazards approaches. We're going to focus on one of those in particular today. We also include advantages and key talking points. What does it take to get the job across the finish line, to adopt a new comprehensive plan or make an amendment to an existing one? What are some of the challenges you can expect to run into depending on your community's context? You'll see the icons on the right hand. The comp plan, again, is one that touches any hazard in Colorado. These are the hazards that were profiled in the guidebook. You've got avalanche, you've got earthquake, you've got hazardous spills. So basically, anything and everything can be covered and addressed by your comprehensive plan. Let's take a quick step back at what the typical traditional comprehensive plan used to look like. And again, things are kind of shifting over recent years, but common elements of a comp plan, you're usually going to have a land use component. That's really the primary driver for updating or adopting a new comprehensive plan. You talk about transportation. How do these things relate to each other? And then you'll see some of those in the middle. Well, what about the environment? And oftentimes, unfortunately, the environmental element never talked about natural hazards. There's a focus on wildlife. There's usually a focus on resources, but very infrequently do they mention natural hazards until recently, and you'll hear a couple of studies today. Increasingly, you're hearing about sustainability and resilience as an overarching theme for comprehensive plans. So let's get into the various approaches, and the guide covers these in more detail. The first being the common theme approach. So this is one that cross-cuts the list of elements that I listed here. How do natural hazards impact the transportation decisions that we make? How do natural hazards impact our housing decisions? So taking the cross-cutting theme approach is a really good idea because you're starting to draw those linkages for the reader. Another option is the individual element, where you are basically dedicating a new chapter or a new element of your comprehensive plan to focus on natural hazard mitigation. This is a great idea. It's a good way to emphasize to your community, to your appointed and elected officials, how important hazard mitigation is. The third is the staple-on method, we're calling it. If you recently adopted a hazard mitigation plan, staple that on to the back of your hazard mitigation plan, and you can reference it throughout the document. I'm not sure this is always the best approach, but because both plans can be very lengthy and complex, this is where some communities land. The fourth option is just cross-referencing throughout your comprehensive plan. Mention that, hey, my community has a community wildfire protection plan. We should mention that plan in the housing section. We should mention that plan in the transportation and the economy section. We can link by hyperlink and cross-reference to our adopted hazard mitigation plan. So what you'll find is that many communities are not just choosing one of these approaches. In fact, they're using a combination of multiple approaches to get the job done. Let's just focus in a little bit more on the common theme approach. So again, cross-cutting those elements based on the commonality of hazard mitigation. So I'm going to walk through just 3 elements here and see how your policies might be shaped when we start looking at hazard mitigation. So transportation. This is a really big deal and often a cross-cutting approach that most communities who are developing a comp plan, they have to think about land use and transportation and how do they connect to each other. When we look at hazard mitigation, you can shape policy to consider, how are residents and emergency vehicles getting in and out of a subdivision? There are subdivisions out there that have been dubbed by emergency managers to be suicide subdivisions because there are so many traps within the road network, so many bottlenecks to where if a big hazard comes, it's going to be very difficult to ensure everybody's survival and property surviving as well. So through your policies, you might make recommendations to require multiple points of access, to better connect your neighborhoods and provide better street grid networks where possible to avoid those traps and ultimately to improve your evacuation times. Thinking about housing, again, another very important topic in your comp plan. Colorado's growing rapidly, so housing density is a very important issue to address through your policies. But are we directing density of housing in the appropriate locations, to safe locations? When we think about affordable housing, I have not worked for a community that says, we don't want any more affordable housing. So are you placing, is there a disproportionate amount of affordable housing in hazardous areas? It's important as you're developing policy to honestly answer those types of questions. And then for the houses that are already built, are there things we could be doing through other policies, through other decision-making avenues to strengthen those structures, either through infrastructure improvements or loan programs that could potentially improve these properties? Let's think about recreation and tourism. This is the only required element in Colorado statutes for developing a comprehensive plan. But how can you link some of the secondary benefits? For instance, we're not just preserving open space, we're creating a recreation opportunity for people, and we're also avoiding development in a hazardous area. Rivers are really pretty places, but they also, as we very well know in Colorado, create floodplain issues. There are landslide and soil issues next to the beautiful places. So how can we make those linkages for the reader? And more importantly, how can we direct policy to identify potential land acquisitions to make sure that we're not generating more development in areas where it should not be? Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the future land use map. So most communities, when adopting a comprehensive plan, include a future land use map. Of course, we're planners, so we have an acronym. We call it the FLUM. It's a very interesting acronym. But if you have a future land use map, really this is your opportunity to start laying out some scenarios for growth and development. How are we directing policy? How are we making sure that development ends up in the right place? Avoiding development altogether is probably the best course of action to protect property and keep people safe, but that is not a very palatable solution in most scenarios. So how can we not just talk about avoiding development, but also increasing densities in the safe areas? So ideally, what would that look like? Well, the green arrows are saying, hey, this is a safe place to be. Let's start talking about higher densities in those locations. Let's get more mixed use in those locations. And let's protect where you see the open space there. This is a hazardous area. There's landslide, rockfall, wildfire, floodplains. So let's avoid those areas and, again, connect with our open space policies as well and try to do the best thing for our community. But we know this ideal scenario is not really how it works out. You have to make compromises. So there are many competing interests in your community that are going to push your elected officials. They are going to push your development community, and your residents will be concerned. We've always been here. What about economic development? How can you tell me that I can't locate my business here, even if it's in a hazard zone? We understand how planning works, but it's important to make sure that hazard mitigation is at least one factor when you're making these important decisions on the land use map. Last slide, and then we'll move into the case studies. We've got some great ones today from Colorado. Just wanted to urge you again to visit the Planning for Hazards site. This is Dale Case from Boulder County. He's got some wonderful videos up, as well as Karen and Jim Kernut as well from Summit County. They want to share their stories with you, and if you don't want to read pages of text online, these videos share a lot of the same information that you can find there. So have fun with it, and thanks again for being with us today. Let's jump into the case studies.
Hello, this is Rachel Bacon with Adams County. I'm a senior long-range planner for the county. I want to start off by thanking DOLA for the invitation to present on this webinar today, and also for their excellent assistance. So 5 years ago, they provided us with funding and technical assistance so that Adams County was able to be the first county in Colorado, really a pilot program, to integrate hazard mitigation into our comprehensive plan. So as we get going, I'm not going to read all of this on the screen, but I put it up here because I think it's very important that as we go about integrating hazard mitigation into our comprehensive plan, as we convince our policymakers and our electeds that the funding and the emphasis is really important, consider timing, framing, and strategic messaging. We know that when a natural disaster happens, people care very much, but as time goes on, they tend to forget just how important it is to protect people, property, and infrastructure. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in my presentation, effective framing, and also just to give you some perspective on how we have been successful and how we choose to integrate our hazard mitigation plan into our comprehensive plan to have even more success in the future. This is a picture from the flood of 2013. So even though about 9 or 10% of all Coloradans, and then of course, related infrastructure and property are within Adams County, there was more than $1 billion worth of damage from that flood, but only 1.2 million of it occurred within Adams County. And so I think that's really a great testament to our already excellent floodplain regulations and other land use regulations that we've had in place for a while, especially when you consider that both the Platte River and the Clear Creek do run through Adams County. So real quick on our community profile, Adams County is the second fastest county within the Denver metro area. You can see we're just north of Denver here on your screen. It's a very large county, and it's also very urban and very rural. We have residents who live in 8 different cities and 2 different towns. We're presently right under 500,000 people, and that is going to nearly double by the year 2040. So when Logan was talking quite a bit about all of the growth that's occurring in Colorado, that's definitely a concern for us and other counties within the metro area. And then also balancing, the very different environment that we have in both the rural areas and within our urban areas. More testament to this on this slide. But I think the most important thing to note here is that, we're also a very diverse county. We're not very economically prosperous. And jobs and economic development, like Tarek was mentioning, are a big deal. We do need to have quality economic development within our county, but we have to find the right places to put it. And also not only thinking about where is a good place for these more hazardous types of job-producing industries to go, but then also how do we keep our residents and our parks and our more sensitive types of uses from locating within those more tricky areas. And so a little bit more on the population growth. We're seeing, about 750,000 by 2040, and also employment. We're growing by about 67% also by 2040. And this is important also because Adams County is the first or second most industrial county within the state of Colorado. So we have a lot of excellent jobs, as you see, going from about 200,000 or so jobs today up until about 337 jobs in 2040. And those are really primarily, a lot of them, going to be in commercial, industrial, and other types of more risk-adverse types of industries. So our comprehensive plan, Imagine Adams County, was adopted in 2012, and so what that means is that we are due for our 5-year update of our hazard mitigation plan. So that is underway right now. So in addition to integrating our hazard mitigation plan into our comprehensive plan also integrates our transportation plan and our parks and open space plan. And this is really important because it allows for that cross-sector pollination of both strategies, recommendations, and action items, et cetera. So that's a really powerful tool for us because we know that when we're talking about getting in and out of subdivisions, as Tarek mentioned, that our transportation policies are pretty important for that. Additionally, too, it allows for parks, trails, sidewalk transportation projects to fuel into our capital improvement program and have that integrated approach. And I'll talk a little bit more about the role of the comprehensive plan and the capital improvement program and some opportunities to actually make that relationship even more robust here in a moment. So really this comprehensive plan integration update was a really great opportunity for planners and emergency managers to get together, to think very critically in the same room, in the same place about those cross-cutting items and objectives. Also, too, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but I mean, we all have short staffs. We have limited resources, and so this is a great way for us to pool resources from DOLA, from other sources, so that we can have really robust and complex plans that complement one another rather than one-offs that tend to just stick on the shelf. So why do we integrate these plans? And I do want to note, too, that Adams County has the very first type of strategy that Tarek mentioned, so it's really a common theme, cross-cutting element. We integrate our hazard mitigation plan, our transportation plan, our parks and open space plan throughout our comprehensive plan, but then we also have been known to additionally do the staple-on method when plans get a little bit long and a little bit intense. This, too, also is something to consider and balance carefully. Because the hazard mitigation plan for FEMA has a 5-year update, that does mean that I am doing, of course, a full comprehensive plan update every 5 years as well. So think critically about your resources and your timing and your staff when you choose which way to integrate your hazard mitigation plan into your comprehensive plan. Okay, so why are these important? Well, the comprehensive plan and the transportation plan are guiding policy documents. But in the state of Colorado, we do have a nice factor in that every land use case must be weighed against its conformance with the comprehensive plan. And so this is an excellent tool in that you'll have your planners, you'll have your development review team, which often has transportation folks, engineer, long-range planners, your county health department, your parks and rec people, those really smart people that get together within a room, and now they're comparing those individual land use cases against complex maps and systems that have the concerns of all of these things. And so getting hazard mitigation to the table at that key moment in time when a project is just very conceptual, a location is desired, is really an important tool. Additionally, we were able to map all of our hazard mitigation plan elements, and so that's everything from our Tier 2 facilities, our hazardous materials, our transportation system, so where does our hazardous waste go, what are the routes, and get those and weigh them against and overlay them against our future land use map, for instance. Where are these facilities existing presently, where we would like them to go in the future, and then also overlay them with our population projections on where we think those jobs and those people need to go over time. And then finally, this allows for those hazard mitigation, specific mitigation actions to end up in our capital improvement program. And that's everything from egress into our park system, making sure our regional parks have good transportation systems, and also careful siting in terms of county facilities as well. We know that counties do have a lot of heavy equipment and other resources available to them, and so if we can situate them such that we can hit higher levels of population growth and then thus people, infrastructure, and property, that we can make more of a difference when disaster does strike. So it's 3 elements then in our comprehensive plan that really do that cross-cutting of hazard mitigation and land use, transportation, parks, etc. So we're trying to reduce risk and the effects of natural hazards. We are trying to increase public awareness of hazard risks, and we are limiting building in high-risk areas and improving disaster prevention. So here on the screen right now, we've got our hazard identification and risk assessment. I'm not going to go into the weeds on this. It's something that pretty much every hazard mitigation plan will have in it. For Adams County, the biggest hazards are, typical, I think, for many counties in Colorado: thunderstorms, winter weather, tornadoes, and flood. What I will point out, though, is that one thing we did, which I think is extremely helpful, it really takes that HERA one step forward, is that we compared it against the capabilities assessment. And so this really painted the landscape in terms of our most at-risk, high-risk hazards. How well are we prepared to address them when they occur? Where are we putting our resources? Where are we putting our emphasis and our efforts? And then this really does help to really inform your implementation and your mitigation actions moving forward. I'll talk briefly about some of our lessons learned. In terms of engagement, we invited all the players to the table, both the public. For us in the county, because we have those really urban areas, it's important that the cities and other stakeholders within our metro were invited to the table. We had a project management team, we invited the electeds, et cetera. And so this is where that framing really is important. Why is this important? Why should you participate? Getting all the right experts into the room, whether it be by invitation or by pushing and screaming and pulling. This is a very important part of it. We've also learned that how we provide outreach and input in addition to that framing is very important because about 60% or so of our residents are Hispanic. We correspondingly have about 30% or so residents who speak Spanish as a primary language, so it's very important that all of our materials are multilingual. We also found it really helpful to let the process inform the process in addition to having the process inform the outcomes. So taking a step back, being reflective along the way. If we aren't succeeding in some way, if the right people are in the room, really addressing those things as we go is very helpful. We brought in subject matter experts, and then I do want to note that in any planning process, and particularly as you integrate such complicated things into one another, there are always kind of chicken and egg sort of situations. So really it is, how much time do we take for our planning process? Is it too rushed? Then people don't feel like they have the time to adequately respond, or if the process takes too long, it feels kind of drug out, people lose interest. So think about that very critically. Also, buy-in versus burn out definitely occurs. So you want balanced participation, but you want to make sure that you're clear about who does what, so understanding roles and who's responsible for plan development, implementation, and performance measurement moving forward is definitely important to consider. Also, it's important, we found, to rethink the traditional community meeting and the online survey. Yeah, those are great tools, but you need to do more than that. You need to do different things than that. So having pop-up events like kite flying or face painting, is a really great way to bring people in, especially the public, rather than just having only open house style meetings. And as I mentioned too, we really need to explain why this is so important and how it makes a difference, because that gets the buy-in from all of your participants on the process. So really think carefully about using good data analysis and storytelling in terms of things like the return on investment. So if we do this now and a tornado or a wildfire or a flood happens, this is what we will save in terms of money. This is what we will save in terms of life. This is what we will save in terms of those transportation systems that are very difficult for us to build. And so related to that, I did just a quick Google search on return on investment hazard mitigation. So what comes up is about 1.5 million results. So there are lots of resources, lots of data, some really cool charts out there to help you tell your story on why this is important, especially if you're in an off year in terms of disasters. You had a good year, people forget, don't always care. Also, I will caution, don't do an image search unless you want to see some really scary things that you don't want happening within your community. So something about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of something. I don't know. So what we're doing right now and what we've learned and what we're thinking about as we go to update our 2012 plan, because we are doing it right now, we are really looking at more of a regional approach to hazard mitigation, both in terms of how we plan, how we adequately address resources or the lack thereof. This might be how we site our emergency vehicles. This might be how our fire districts and fire departments work together in terms of regional coverage rather than just local coverage. We're also really thinking critically about going beyond just hazard mitigation planning. So hazard mitigation planning really is how do we prevent and how do we respond, but resiliency takes that one step farther, and it's really how do we rebuild. And so we're thinking a lot more sustainable planning, a lot more into resiliency, that sort of thing. We're also starting to consider moving beyond the traditional natural disaster sorts of things. I mean, there are certain lists of things that you have to do because FEMA requires them, but really to have a much more integrated plan and think more regionally and be more effective and proactive, we're starting to think more about man-made disasters and hazards, bioterrorism, cybersecurity. You're really getting ahead of what's going on, what potential is out there in terms of hazards. And then finally, we're looking to co-integrate with both facilities planning and emergency operations planning. So it's kind of like, where do you draw the line on how prepared you are? That's always a good question, but I think the more integration you can have with your different types of plans really helps you to be more proactive and less reactive as disasters occur. And then finally, we don't always do a good job, especially those of us in the government, for celebrating our successes. I doubt very many Adams County residents know that we had a very small amount of property damage in those 2013 floods versus every other county. But that's a good story to tell, especially as we go to ask our elected officials for money to do things that make even more of a difference moving forward. There's also great opportunity to have your capital improvement program, not just have projects from your comp plans funneled into it, but as you look at new projects for your capital improvement programming, you can always evaluate them based upon their ability to address hazards and promote resiliency. And then finally, there's a lot of great opportunity for enhanced data modeling as we move forward. GIS is just getting better and better. As Tarek mentioned, our more vulnerable populations are often the ones that are hit the hardest in terms of natural disasters. So really critically thinking about your mitigation actions, those things that you do to help prevent or address natural hazards, we can make sure that we have a better impact on those who are more vulnerable, for instance. So lots of great opportunities to overlay data and think critically about how we can do a better job. So at this point, I will turn it over to Karen.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thanks everybody for participating. I'm Karen Birchtold, and I'm a planner with the City of Manitou Springs. Manitou Springs is in the Pikes Peak region. So we have just posted an adoption draft of Plan Manitou. Plan Manitou is our integrated community master plan and hazard mitigation plan. And so I'll talk more on our approach to integrating these two components. Manitou Springs was founded in 1872, and it's the first resort community in the state of Colorado. Tourism is still the primary economic base. In terms of our growth and development, we cover an area of a little over 3 square miles, about 5,500 people. And the community is very compact and largely built out with minimal opportunity for additional expansion. So quite a contrast to the Adams County development scenario. We do have a history of hazards, primarily flooding. And we were severely impacted by flooding in 2013, and this was exacerbated from the effects of the Waldo Canyon fire and damage to a watershed above our community. So this really, I think, prompted more consideration of long-range planning. The community had a vision plan, but it didn't have a comprehensive plan with tools such as a future land use plan and an implementation plan. So it's set the stage for us to move forward with a comprehensive plan that really addressed our hazard risk and enhanced our resiliency. Regional context is important to understand in our situation. We have the urbanized community of Colorado Springs to the east. And to the west, we have the Pikes Peak Wilderness and substantial open space, federal, state, privately held. So definitely a wildland-urban interface area. I think this image illustrates both why it's a desirable place to live, but also the hazard risk inherent in this location, with substantial steep slopes and creeks running along the bottom of canyons. A little bit about our plan organization and community engagement. We funded this project with a HUD CDBG Disaster Recovery Resilience Grant administered through the Department of Local Affairs. We also engaged a consultant team with a planning project manager to oversee a team of specialists. Our scope included a hazard mitigation plan that we'll submit to FEMA for approval. So we also engaged a hazard mitigation specialist as part of our team. We structured our outreach across about a year's worth of time with 5 major events with smaller opportunities in between. We convened a citizens advisory committee for the master plan portion and a hazard mitigation team, but we encouraged those teams to review all aspects of the plan. And as we move forward, we really thought about how we make this integration happen. Data and mapping is an important consideration for this type of project, and we needed a land use map. We used our online GIS service and created an application through something called Collector to use an iPad in the field to inventory our housing and our land use. And we engaged 2 interns from University of Colorado at Colorado Springs to complete the inventory. I think if you're a community with more recent development, you can probably get most of your information from plats and maps. But we have really eclectic historic development patterns. So if you're that type of community, I think this approach works really well. Early on, we conducted our risk assessment with guidance from our mitigation consultant. And we learned that our 3 highest risks are flooding, wildfire, and geologic hazards. These are all location-specific risks, so this enabled us to map this risk, and we can use this data to guide our growth, development, and other policies. So after completing our risk assessment, we identified our risk vulnerabilities. So this is our community assets, our people, our built environment, our economy, and our natural environment. And we looked at how hazards have addressed these assets in the past and how they relate to our mapped hazard risk. And so we relied on our master plan planning elements to do this. So we went through these different topics and identified how they're most vulnerable to risk. We found that we have substantial existing development in high hazard risk areas. And so this really formed the basis of our hazard mitigation strategy. I think with a comprehensive plan, you're really looking at a layered approach to developing this plan. You start with the broad, which are your planning elements, and get more specific with your policies. And then you have your land use plan as a major layer and a component. And then you get more specific with your implementation plan. And in our case, we have both short-term actions and long-term actions in our plan. So I think what's helpful about this approach is you start out with some really challenging hazards, but this helps you map out a feasible strategy. And so I'll share a few examples from these different layers of our approach and how we wove in our hazard mitigation strategy. So in terms of policies, I'll focus mainly on those policies related to land use, but we had goals and policies to support hazard mitigation really throughout all of our different planning elements. And really land use is an area where we were particularly lacking. So we started out with a policy to support all hazards, to guide new development away from and discourage density increases in high hazard areas, and to use incentives to support this implementation. For flooding, we'll encourage flood mitigation measures for existing structures, and again apply incentives and best practices to really discourage development from these high risk areas. We also have wildland-urban interface risk, and risk to existing and future development in these areas should be mitigated to the extent possible. And so we need, through these strategies, to address both existing and future development. And you really key in on your language. Are you preventing? Are you discouraging? Are you mitigating? And how will you support those policies later on through your actions? Future land use. So this is our first future land use plan. It's very much informed by our hazard risk assessment, but it's also informed by our other plan goals and policies. And we found that we really have a real shortage of vacant land. And so when we talked about growth and development with the public, they thought that we should permit some development in areas of hazard risk to meet our goals in areas such as housing and economic development, but that we should strengthen our standards that we currently have to reduce this risk and promote safer growth. And so a couple of examples here. On the western part of town, we've designated a hillside low density category for this area. We're expecting some new development here, but it does include wildfire and geologic hazard risk, so we need some mitigation strategies to address that risk. In the eastern portion of town, we have an area that's really our most viable economic development area. It's our urban renewal area district. We have some vacant land, some underutilized buildings, and so we want to encourage development here. But it does have land with floodplain risk, and so will require mitigation of floodplain hazards in this gateway mixed-use area. So moving into implementation, these are our short-term actions. For all hazards, we'll adopt a formal development review process so we can do more careful analysis of hazards on a site-level basis and require mitigation measures be taken. We'll also identify funding sources to support private mitigation investment because we have a lot of existing development in hazard areas. This is an important tool. For flooding, we're developing guidelines and best practices for mitigating flood impacts to our historic structures. So we want to engage property owners to be proactive with our important historic resources. We'll also develop a stronger floodplain management program and regulations that are more stringent than our current regulations, and also use incentive approaches to guide development away from the floodplain. We have geologic risk areas, so we'll strengthen regulations that apply to those areas to reduce unsafe growth. And then finally, we have wildfire risk area as well. We'll begin with a community wildfire prevention plan, and this will be taken on by our fire department. They'll engage a more detailed assessment of fire risk by parcel, and they'll do some very intensive community outreach and education. And so we think this will pave the way for us to begin developing what's called wildland-urban interface regulations to apply to new development as well as infill and major renovations to reduce wildfire risk. And so finally, our long-term actions. These are actions that would take place in possibly 3 years. And these are actions that will take some time to have an impact, but we do want to start as soon as we can. So in terms of wildfire mitigation, we'll address risk to existing structures by incorporating new building materials and design standards that will apply to major renovations for existing development in high wildfire risk area. We have a creek corridor, Fountain Creek, that's very impacted. So we'll extend a linear park that's begun through that area and do additional bank restoration and further planning to really try to remediate damage to the creek channel and bank. And then we'll also develop a strategy to bring more of our private commercial and residential structures into compliance with our floodplain standards. But we expect this to take some time. So we also have some lessons learned from this process. It's a fairly complex plan. We're asking the public to jump into some pretty complex thinking here, and it's a large document. So we found, particularly towards the end of the process, that focused questions to really direct citizens' attention to certain topics work really well, and that our public really welcomed those. We also know that our public now understands what a comprehensive planning process is like, but they're really anxious to see us move towards action. And then finally, we have a pretty ambitious program here, and so we know that we have to further build our organizational capacity. So we'll continue to engage students, which we've been really fortunate in doing. We'll engage other professionals to help us address some of these challenges. So we're really looking forward to jumping into our implementation component. And as I mentioned, we've posted our adoption draft, and so we welcome you to take a look at that at www.planmanitou.com, and are certainly more than willing to share any aspects of our experience with people who are interested.
Great. Well, thank you, Rachel, Karen, and Tarek, for your expertise and your experience in integrating hazards into the comprehensive plan. Really quickly, this is our contact information. I'm not going to spend too much time here so that we can get to the final section of our webinar today, which is the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please type them into the box below. Uh-oh. Yeah, and if you have any questions, please type them into the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. We have some expertise here, so we'd love to utilize the time while we have it. So please feel free to shoot over any thoughts or questions.
While we're waiting, I have a question. This is Andy Hill, and I'm just curious. I really appreciate that you spent a little time talking about, Rachel, that you spent a little time talking about some lessons that you've learned now that you've done this several years ago. And you did cover, like, okay, if you integrate the hazards mitigation plan as part of your comp plan and you have to update both every 5 years, that's a really valuable lesson learned for others to think about if they want to do that or not. Do you have any other kinds of sort of tidbits on, you know, gosh, next time we're gonna do it differently?
Yeah, I think really moving beyond those typical FEMA required types of hazards, those natural hazards, so fire, earthquake, flood, those are pretty common. But we know now, you know, so much of our systems are really integrated and based upon technology in terms of response time and mitigation. And so really thinking about, you know, if we have, for instance, an internet outage in addition to a wildfire, in addition to an earthquake, how does that really impact our ability to be responsive? So making sure we have those redundancies in our technology, I think, is important. Also, too, I mean, it could be, you know, a double-edged sword if there's an act of terrorism or bioterrorism, and the timing was such that there's also a natural disaster. You know, how do we deal with multiple natural disasters at once? So really getting ahead and being proactive and responsive, thinking of worst-case scenario planning, I guess, is probably the best way to phrase it, but really evaluating in terms of our HERA and in terms of our capabilities assessment, different scenarios, I think, is a really good way to be responsive.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. We have another question?
I saw a good question up on the screen about FEMA's review when someone decides to integrate natural hazards and their hazard mitigation plan into the comp planning process. Adams County has already gone through that once. Karen, you are about to go through that.
We are.
My understanding, that after speaking with several folks at FEMA who do those reviews, is that it's a little more challenging, and that, you know, to make their job easier, the staple-on method sure looks great to them because they can follow the crosswalk for review and quickly identify, did you hit the pieces that are required for FEMA funding? But they also recognize that this is a growing trend to be more resilient, to find the cross-linkages between planning elements. That I think they are constantly looking at ways to encourage integration and also improve their review of those. Have you heard from FEMA now that you're getting ready to submit?
Well, I know that our plan reviewers at DHSEM are pretty excited about this approach. It is new, though, and so how our plan is structured is that our risk assessment and hazard mitigation strategy are separate in our appendix. So those are still structured the way they always have been. And so then the hazard mitigation strategy carries over into our master plan through the policies and then the different actions. So they're probably getting a lot more information than they're used to.
It's a really good question.
And that brings up the point, too, of one of the reasons that we do this is to be eligible for FEMA funding. So by doing our hazard mitigation planning, you know, if something does happen, then we can be eligible, you know, both in terms of mitigation actions, so putting in things such as, emergency response systems, or, you know, when we look at our emergency operations plans, once we do have a natural disaster, how can we potentially be reimbursed from the state and from the feds, you know, when there is a disaster declared. And so that's really important things to consider, is that we need to be really proactive in our planning so that when something does happen, we can get funding for it, and also that we can also prevent, you know, those natural disasters from being humongous, tremendous financial considerations.
Great. We had another question about these slides being available. They will be available on our planningforhazards.com website. They'll also be available, as well as this webinar, this recorded webinar, at the Department of Local Affairs Community Development Office webpage as well. And I will send those links and all this information to all registrants after the webinar today. So quick clarification there.
Rachel, do you have your capabilities assessment somewhere where people can access it, or is that more internal?
No, it's part of our plan, so it's definitely available.
In there.
Mm-hmm. Yes, if you go to www.adcogov.org and then in the search box you put in Imagine Adams County, you'll see our whole comprehensive plan. You'll be able to understand how all of our plans, our transportation plan, our parks plan, our hazard mitigation plan, are integrated. And then also, too, you will see more detailed things like our mitigation action guides are a staple on in the plan.
And Manitou Springs also has a capabilities assessment
Great.
as part of our plan.
So if there are any other questions, please type them in now.
I understand Silt and Morgan County are going to be updating their comp plans this year, among some others. So if you guys have any advice from them you haven't already shared, otherwise I'm sure they'll be reaching out to you both, or the three of you, to get some ideas.
So one last question from Tiana. It looks like, what are our community's biggest hurdles in putting these plans together? What are your biggest challenges?
Well, speaking for Manitou Springs, for a smaller community, it's tough to get the manpower to do this kind of plan. And being our first comprehensive plan, we had a lot of data to pull together. So that's a hurdle that at least we've gotten over for the next go-round. I think another challenge is, particularly if it's a community that's had a disaster or a series of disasters, people are really busy addressing those issues. And so you need to overcome that a bit. We found that having a technical advisory committee where we ask staff to come and having reviewed the plan just was not going to be feasible. So you need to kind of come up with some creative approaches as the project manager to reach out to people, try and really help them focus in on those areas where you think they'll have concerns. I think that's also similar for the public that's gone through a disaster. They're a little bit fatigued, so you need to come up with some kind of unique approaches to get around that, usually by going to them.
So I could talk all day about the challenges for comprehensive planning, but I'm going to pick up on two specific things. The first is that, a hazard mitigation plan, it can be challenging, that it can be kind of technical, but typically it's not super controversial. It's pretty easy to agree on overarching thought processes and beliefs that, yeah, we don't really want bad things to happen here. Versus comprehensive plans can be a lot more controversial. You're talking about visions and goals and where you want to be when you grow up as a community, and then also too, those future land use maps, especially if you're starting from the very beginning, can be very challenging to get adopted and approved. People definitely want to haggle over what their property should be in the future, even if it's in a high-risk area or in the floodplain, et cetera. There will be concerns about the taking of property rights, et cetera. So by integrating your comp plan and your hazard mitigation plan, you go from taking a plan that's very technical and maybe a little bit confusing and overwhelming, but pretty palatable to the public, and then you start aligning it with a plan that can be a lot more challenging to get adopted and approved. And when you've got a 5-year requirement on your hazard mitigation plan, your comp plan can then drag that timeline down. So that, I think, is probably the biggest number one challenge. And then the second biggest challenge, I would say, does go to that fact that these are very technical documents. It does take a lot of brain power and manpower, and you don't always have that. And so one thing we're doing to really get around that and be ahead of that is really integrating our emergency operations staff with our planning staff. So for instance, we're trying to get all of our planning staff through our emergency operations training, so that when there is a disaster, we're prepared to help staff the emergency managers. We understand what they're dealing with, where they're coming from. Our planning director serves on the LEPC, the Local Emergency Planning Committee, and then, vice versa, we're providing support staff in terms of the planning components to our emergency operations staff. And we're also working more broadly with those technical advisory committees in terms of transportation or parks or other components, just to bring more expertise and more manpower to the table. So those are the two big ones that I think are most important.
Great. That was a great question to end on. Thank you, Tiana. Appreciate it. Just in conclusion here, this webinar is going to be posted again to our planningforhazards.com website, as well as the Department of Local Affairs Community Development Office webpage, and I'll send that information out to all registrants as soon as we can get everything pulled together. We will be hosting several more webinars through the course of 2017 and beyond. So keep your eyes open for some notifications and new events and flyers coming down the pipe. So, and with that, I would like to thank all of our participants, and especially our speakers, for taking the time out of your day to share your expertise and listen and learn.